Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinAbox.com. Today we're going to be rebuilding the AD series, popular on GM trucks and vans. This is the AD 230 size and the AD 244. You can see the differences in the physical sizes of them. Most of the parts for the kits are interchangeable. You can recognize easily that you have an AD 244 by the space in between the two halves. The AD 230 has a thin line where the parts split in half. First thing to do is take a rag, put it around the pulley, set the pulley in the vise, and tighten it up loosely. Then we're going to take two screwdrivers and insert them in the two holes much like the 130D and pry outward. Here you can see the two rectangular holes, and we're just putting screwdrivers down in them and prying outward so that the hook on the bottom of the clips move out and we can raise the top. Same way with the one on the other side. Stick the screwdriver in and pull out on it. Then taking a look underneath, basically it breaks down into three separate components. The voltage regulator here, held on by these three Torx head screws. The brush holder assembly, and the rectifier with the three stator leads coming up. Those need to be unsoldered to tear the thing apart, and that's basically it. Now we need to remove the 7 screws that hold the voltage regulator and the rectifier to the rear frame. You can see we highlight them with yellow paint. These are E5s, Torx head screws. Take them off with an E5 socket. And there's 4 of them that hold the rectifier on and 3 that hold the voltage regulator on. So take all 7 of those out. You're going to have to pry up on the rectifier with the screwdriver to get it to break loose. And be careful that you don't lose the plastic insulator that's right here. Here's a shot of the bottom side of the rectifier, and that's where that plastic insulator goes on before you put it back together. Also, you'll notice a flat insulator stuck to the bottom of the positive rectifier. You want to peel that off and use that on the new rectifier. Now we're going to remove the plastic insulator for the stator wires. We're using a 1/2 inch impact on reverse and a 15/16 socket to take the pulley off. Hold the pulley with a rag. Put the nut back on the shaft so that half the threads on the nut are still showing. Remove the 4 bolts that hold the 2 halves together. You can use a 1/4 inch 6-sided socket. Apply a penetrating oil to the shaft bearing area. Allow the penetrant to work for about 5 minutes, and then hold the alternator by the bottom frames with both hands. We're going to slap the shaft down on the flat part of the vise while holding onto the bottom, pushing down on the bottom frame. Then you can take the pulley nut off and finish taking it apart. Here's the alternator broken into 2 pieces. If this spacer is loose enough to take it off, and remember that the flat side goes out when the shaft's going up in the air. Hold on to the shaft with one hand and tap down on the outer part of the front plate with a ball peen hammer. The brush holder is held into the rear plate with two plastic lineup pins. Turn the plate over and tap out the lineup pins gently with the Phillips screwdriver. The front bearing has a 1/16 of an inch lip cold rolled into the aluminum drive-in plate. They put the bearing in and then cold roll a lip over top of the edges of the bearing all the way around. We need to chisel some of that off to make the bearing easier to get out. So I took a flat tip screwdriver and sharpened it up a little bit on the grindstone, and I'm going to go around and tap it with a hammer to push some of the aluminum back out of the way. Now here's how we're going to get the bearing out. Take the pulley, the front part, the part that's normally out, put that down over the bearing, centered. Then take a 1 1/4 socket and set it up on the vise. Then take a 3/4 socket and give it 2 hard smacks so that just the very edge of it starts to break loose. You can't pound it all the way out. The idea is just to get it started. Then you can hold it in your hand finish tapping it out. Bake the drive-in housing in an oven set to 350 for about 20 minutes. Then put red Loctite on the outside of the bearing and just drop it in. Now we're going to use a retainer method called staking, and what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the aluminum that is left on the side of the outer race. You take a chisel and make a chisel mark on the very edge of it sideways so it gets pushed over all the way around. And you do that like 20 or 30 times around the entire diameter of the outer race of the bearing. You need a chisel that's been sharpened up to a point. What I'm doing is I'm putting the corner of the chisel on the edge of the plate and hitting it at an angle. And here you can see where the aluminum has been pushed over to retain the bearing every 1/4 inch all the way around. It's when you drive the chisel down in there, it folds it over. For the next step, we need a Dremel and some carbide cutting wheels. Get the reinforced ones that are available at Walmart. What we're doing is we're removing the rear bearing from the shaft. So we have to scribe a line in the width of the side of the bearing. This is an operation that requires full eye protection. So after you get a line cut in the outer race, then you can take a screwdriver and stick it in between there and wedge it apart to finish breaking it off. And then you'll be able to get to the cage and the balls and take a pair of wire cutters or tin snips or something and just carefully take everything apart piece by piece till you're left with the inner race. Spray a small amount of rust bust or penetrating oil on the inner shaft, on the inner race that's left. And if you put the rotor in a vise, sometimes you can get a screwdriver and a hammer to tap the inner race off. If it doesn't want to come for you, you can always use the same method that you used with the outer race, and that's take the Dremel and scribe a line. Also, you can, if it doesn't seem to want to cooperate at that point, you can also turn it over 180 degrees and then scribe another line on the other side, and the stuff comes right off. Now at this point we need to take a piece of sandpaper or a piece of Scotch-Brite and polish up the shaft. Also polish up the copper slip ring. If you do have partial grooves in the slip ring, use the Scotch-Brite and polish down inside the grooves. They would be considered reusable as long as there's no plastic showing through the bottom after you've cleaned it all up. In other words, you need to see copper all the way around after you're done. Also clean up the shaft with Scotch-Brite or fine sandpaper where the rear bearing is going to be placed. Place a couple drops of oil on the shaft, spread it around with your finger. Insert the spacer. The raised up portion goes in towards the rotor body. Then you can put the shaft assembly inside the drive-in housing. Now we're putting the pulley back on, pretty much the opposite of the way we took it off. Install the supplied lock washer, start the nut, hold on to the pulley in one hand, a rag, then we have the 15/16 socket and the 1/2 inch impact. Put a couple drops of oil on the shaft where the rear bearing rides and spread that around with your finger. Now we need to select a deep well socket as a bearing installation tool. Here we have a 3/4. First thing to consider when selecting a deep well socket to use as a bearing installation tool is you have to check it to make sure that there's no interference, because you don't want the bottom of the socket to scar up the slip ring as you're installing the bearing. The other thing to consider is select a socket that is roughly the same inside diameter as the inside diameter of the bearing, because when you're tapping it on, you don't want to have any contact with the outer part of the bearing or the race. As you're tapping the bearing on, it should only be contacting the inner race. Now at this point we want to pause for a minute and check to make sure that none of the windings in the stator are going to rub on the fan of the rotor as it turns. So just take a screwdriver and run it around here so that you look carefully all the way around, and if there's any windings that seem to be out of place a little bit, put them back where they go. Then we're going to set the lid on, and you'll notice that this groove right here will line up with the middle wire. Then we can just tap it on. After it's most of the way on, put the 4 bolts in. and tighten them up in a cross pattern. Tighten these two first, then these two, and then go around and tighten them up evenly. Now you want to pick it up and hold it in your hand and give the pulley a spin with your other hand to make sure that nothing is hitting internally. If you get a little bit of a hit, you can tap on the sides or tap down on it and then retighten the bolts. Then we're just going to set the plastic insulator back on the 3 wires again. Now we're going to put the black insulator in the hole where it goes, and we're going to put the new insulator on the positive side of the rectifier. The positive side of the rectifier is the side with the battery post coming out. If there's an original brown one on there, you can leave that on there and put this right on top of it. Okay, now we're going to talk about the brushes being installed in the brush holder. First of all, you have to get the slant right. And the way that we know that it's installed properly is we have a saying, it's called left to right uphill. The left side of the brush to the right side of the brush, the slant's going uphill as you're facing the brush holder, laying just like that. That's the bottom of the brush holder where it contacts the slip ring and housing, and this is the top of the brush holder, and that's the way that it's viewed going left to right. You can see that the old brushes are still in there and they have the approximate slant left to right. There's some curvature to them where they started to wear in. Also, you want to note that we have a big hole brush and a small hole brush. The big hole brush goes on top and the bottom hole brush goes on the bottom. The small hole brush goes on the bottom. The way this comes apart is, if you look at the top, you'll see the lid. There's a single clip and two double clips on the other side. Just take a pocket screwdriver and pry that open, and then the other side rocks right off. Then you can take these out, and I'm putting the big hole brush in first, and the slant is left to right uphill. And now I'm putting the small one underneath the way we're viewing it, left to right uphill. So we got big hole on the top, small hole on the bottom, and then stick the lid back on. We have some areas that we need to clean up with a wire toothbrush or a piece of sandpaper on the slip ring end housing. These 3 areas here, buff those real good, and take a layer of either dielectric grease or a little bit of white lithium grease and smear it on that surface with your finger to prevent further corrosion. Now what we're going to do is, you can see the 2 pegs here where they line up in the 2 holes. Take either a pocket screwdriver or a knife blade or any type of a tool whatsoever and push the brushes back in and just set them on there. Then we're ready to put the rectifier on. Then we're going to put the 4 Torx bolts that hold the rectifier down. This is the negative side, this is the positive side. 2 bolts on each side. Tighten those back down again. Then there's some more areas that we have to clean before we put the voltage regulator back on. Clean around the outside diameter of this post. On the actual flat part of the rectifier, take either a wire toothbrush or better yet even some 80 grit sandpaper and clean around the entire surface area where this is going to make contact. Then on this ferrule, clean this area here and this area here, because that becomes a contact point for this part of the voltage regulator. We're going to slide that tab onto the rectifier. Put a little bit of dielectric grease here and here and push that down on there. Then put these 3 bolts in. There used to be 2 tabs here, but now there's only 1 because we cut 1 off. The replacement voltage regulator only requires 1 tab. One important step to this voltage regulator conversion is there has to be pressure on that ferrule to make contact so that it goes into the regulator for a feed. So you always install a bottom nut and torque it down, then put your battery connection on, and then use that as a retaining nut. Now we have 4 areas that need soldered. This one right here is pretty much self-explanatory. Solders up real easy. Now we've arrived at one of the final steps, and it presents itself as a bit of a challenge. What we have to do is resolder the rectifier leads to the stator leads. And the way you do that is spread them out and clean everything up as much as you can. Pull up with a pair of needle nose so that the stator leads are pulled up as far as they possibly can get. Then push that down on there so that there's as much surface area as possible. Then crimp and solder. If these end up sticking out a little bit too far, it's not really a problem because there is a relief area in the cover. But they have to be very effectively soldered. Make sure that the solder melts in very efficiently at this point. Now you just take the cap, set it back on there, and give it a tap.